the way we're going to do this tonight is not as much a back and forth conversation. I'm going to ask David to really take some time and help us understand. And he's got expertise, meaning he has experience in persevering and still walking with the Lord. So, David, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, and because you're known to New Englanders, and then just go ahead and you'll take the next amount of time, and those of us on the webinar, we can type in questions in the chat. We're going to have a time for question and response, question and answers for the last several minutes, and so hopefully David will get some questions that he can speak to. I think his presentation will speak to all of us wherever we are in that race that's been marked out for us. So welcome, David.
Thank you, Robbie. It's really great to be with all of you tonight, and good to be back again connected to folks in New England. I love New England. We spent much of our life in ministry there over the years, and I will introduce myself in just a few minutes, but I will tell you this as I began tonight, talking about the perseverance of the pastor, that I had an early experience in my life ministry in Brunswick, Maine, that went amazingly well for me in terms of the impact it had on my life. We're not a lot of numbers to show for it, not a lot of significant things that the world around would look at and say, "Man, this is incredible." But what it did in my heart, it literally transformed my ministry, because if that had not happened, I don't know if I'd be in ministry today. And that was less than 5 years after I was ordained to ministry many, many years ago. My name is David Jackson, and I have been in ordained ministry since 1979. That's 45 years ago now. Been with the North American Mission Board for 40 of those years, serving in a variety of capacities across the country, married to my wife for 39 of those years. And so in the midst of all the experiences that we've had from coast to coast, from Los Angeles to Boston to Washington, D.C., now living in South Carolina, we've planted churches, we've pastored churches, we've taught in seminaries and colleges, we've transitioned over almost 24 churches as well. I've directed state conventions and our church planting work, and continue to work now on the replant team. I've worked in a variety of different capacities, I guess I would say, and I like to talk about myself as an adventure guide, because I think that's what ministry is. It's an adventure, and we all need folks that have been there and done that to kind of help us navigate the way. And so that's kind of how I see myself in the roles that I have as a coach or a consultant or a transitional pastor, or whatever I'm doing with the North American Mission Board in a variety of ways. But here's a disclaimer, guys. You need to know this. I've never pastored one single church for more than 6 years. So if that immediately kind of turns you off and you say, well, he doesn't know what he's talking about when it comes to this, then I feel free to turn this off and say, man, this guy doesn't know squat about what I have to deal with. The longest ministry station work I ever did was in the Convention of Maryland, Delaware, as the coordinator of church planting there for 13 and a half years. So my assignments have taken me all across the country. I became a Christian in 1966, so that's 58 years ago. So my Lord's been faithful to me, and I've continued in ministry as he's led me in a variety of different ways. But I do want to talk to you tonight, those of you that don't sign off. I want to talk to you about perseverance and the role it plays in our lives. Now, I think you've seen these statistics, or you've heard them if you've been around many Christian leaders in the last few years that have talked about the number of seminary students that are declining and such. They will also bring to your attention the fact that 1 in 2 ministers are leaving ministry within 5 years of starting today. 4 in 5 will leave ministry within 10 years of starting. 42% considered quitting ministry the year after COVID was over in our country. And you can see the sources there for this information. Not everybody agrees with these information. And as we've come through an election year, we know that not all polls are accurate, right? We know that. But these are alarming statistics. If they're anywhere near close, they certainly recognize or call to our attention the fact that we've got some concerns and issues that have to be dealt with in terms of how we go about doing what we do in ministry. So let me give you some other stats that will kind of catch your attention, I think. Church tenure now is somewhere between 2 and 7 years for most pastors. 3.6 years, Converge USA says. That's another conservative Baptist denomination, leaving the average tenure in a Protestant church in America at around 4 years. In Southern Baptist life, the number's a little bit different. Here's the thing that's most surprising about Southern Baptists, that we have a tendency to go from position to position to position over the tenure of our ministry. 87% of Southern Baptists, though, think pastors should stay at one church longer than they do. And then we've got this statistic as well. Some say that a pastor's tenure is a strong indicator of a church's health. And while a long tenure doesn't guarantee a healthy church, a series of short-term pastorates is usually unhealthy for the church, and it may be for the pastor as well. Sad to say that the most common time for pastors to resign or be fired is usually during the first 3 years of their tenure. So that's not very long at all. And we'll come back and talk about that again in just a minute. Now, when Robby asked me to talk about perseverance, I began to think, well, what's the difference between perseverance and endurance? Because I often use those terms almost synonymously, but they aren't actually the same. Endurance really has to do with something that's bearing down, its weight's bearing down upon us, and we're bearing up under the weight of that as we move forward in life. Sometimes we talk about patience and perseverance, but it's really probably a better adjective in describing perseverance because it has to do with waiting diligently. Perseverance really involves both endurance and patience, but it's often defined as a quality of continuing to do something despite the difficulties or obstacles that you encounter with no certain end in sight. In other words, we're not sure how long it's going to take us to get forward in the work that we're doing, but it is a forward moving activity, whereas endurance is holding up under the weight of something on our head. Patience often we think of as more taking our time, being still and in place. Perseverance moves us forward in the struggle that we have to face. And so we see some words like tenacity and grit and determination often associated with perseverance as well. Now, Tom Rainer has done some work at Church Answers on the pastor's life cycle. And in the midst of talking about that, I felt like it was pretty important for us post-COVID to look at the changes that have taken place because they affect the perseverance of a pastor and what we see happening in local churches today. These are the latest research comes out in 2023, in which he says that most pastors enter into a honeymoon period for the first 6 months that they are on site at a church. Now, when he started doing this, he'll say in this document that it was up to 3 years in length, the honeymoon period, but that keeps getting shorter, and it dramatically dropped after COVID. Often this has to do with pastors' expectations and what's taking place, and a lot of frustration and anger that's taking place in the lives of members post-COVID because a lot of folks didn't come back. Second, they move into a period in which they go through a lot of conflict and challenges that can last up to year 4 in the experience of the church. And this is the most difficult period for most pastors to go through. It's the period that you can remember from an earlier slide is the most common era for pastors to either resign or be fired. They may even take another job and just move to another location during this period because they're so frustrated with the conflict that they encounter, the challenges that they face, and they don't know how to deal with that. Maybe they don't know how to deal with that, or they don't want to deal with that. And so they move on somewhere else. Years 4 through 7 used to be growth years, at least the latter part of that period, but now it's what he calls a new stage in the life cycle of a pastor, a stage of acceptance and stability where there's not a whole lot of growth that happens, but the church kind of levels off in terms of its conflict, and he's able to build a solid, stable, consistent foundation for what growth will come later on. Then in years 7 through 10, the defining point for a long-term pastor these years, if he makes it this far, he is persevering. And these are the sweet spot years for a pastor. These are the years in which a church is able to grow and flourish like not before, because at this point, he's got the credibility, he's got the trust, he's built the relationships, he's endured the difficulties, the challenges, the conflicts of the earlier years, and he now truly leads the church. And they are mirroring his character, Robby talked about before, the character of his life, not just his skill set, but the character of his life. He'll see himself in the life of the congregation and vice versa as well. And so while it can be an inflection point, which is either positive or negative, it can move either way depending upon where the pastor's at in his own life and whether he's growing and developing and doing the things that he ought to be doing. It becomes the turning point, as it were, for pastors in ministry. After year 10, Tom Rainer says that they haven't done enough research at Church Answers to find out what really is happening at this stage. But what they do know is that after about every decade of ministry, if his tenure continues, he has to, what Rainer says, is reinvent himself. I'm going to use a different term in just a few minutes on that. But Biola University has done a study that says after year 20, if the pastor's still there, the research shows that most churches don't continue to grow at that point, at least externally. And there are reasons for that we may want to talk about later on too. All right, here's my important note about years 10 to 15. It used to be up to 15 years, but if a pastor stays longer than that, his effectiveness is often because he has a new vision or a new understanding or a new team that he's working with that helps move him forward in the days ahead. That's pretty important. The idea of reinventing himself, it's not about us, right? So if as he captures a new revelation from God, is able to implement that, be able to speak to concerns and issues that are changing in the culture around him, and even put together a team that can help him do that more effectively, he's going to continue to be successful in the years ahead. But that's pretty important. And I know it's pretty hard in New England because most of our churches are single staff churches. So we may want to come back to that too. At the North American Mission Board, we talk about the lack of pastoral longevity contributing to dysfunction and lack of growth in churches. And that often means that they need to be revitalized or maybe even worse, replanted down the road if a pastor doesn't stay. Often replanting takes place best during the transitional periods in between. But we often like to say on the replant team that one of the 4 key pillars to successfully turning around a dying and struggling church is the last one on this list. Do you see it? Stay. Stay. We say preach, pray, love, and stay. Those are the 4 key words, key actions that we think are necessary for a church to be revitalized or replanted. And I would suspect in the early years, even to grow and to flourish, preaching the gospel, praying continually, loving the people that are there as well as the community around you, and staying for the long haul. These are the things that are going to make the difference long term. Now, Robby knows I like to talk about the scripts that run through my head. And so I have this voice in my head, and I know I should check myself into a facility nearby. Maybe I will tomorrow. But I have these lies that I hear in my head often. And Robby also knows I like alliteration. So I've alliterated this just for you, Robby, okay? One of the lies that we believe is that the grass is greener somewhere else. Every one of us that have ever been in ministry has had that lie run through our head. And while it is true that there may be some places where the grass is greener, it may be that it's because it's on top of a septic tank, right? That's what I was told a long time ago. It looks better from a distance, but when you're in the middle of it, it may not nearly be as green and as flourishing as you suspected. In fact, a lot of times the things the search committee tells you are very different from what you experience once you get to the field, right? So this becomes a distraction for us when we're trying to have perseverance in ministry. The idea that some other place is where I ought to consider, or some other place is where I ought to think about investing my ministry. Another lie that I often believe is I'm not making a difference here. I look around at the tangible evidence. Did you hear that? Tangible evidence of success or results, and I'm not seeing anything, and so that discourages me. And out of my discouragement, I conclude I'm not making a difference. But you and I know, and Jesus even taught that much of what has to happen happens in kind of an invisible, unseen way, like a seed that is germinating under the ground. It takes time for things to take place. And I've even been told that it often takes as much as 2.5 times as long as in New England as it does in some other parts of our country. That's part of the cultural makeup of the region that we call New England that makes it so different. Oftentimes we think, man, there are too many obstacles, too much conflict, too many challenges here. I can't overcome that. It's just too great for me. And we feel defeated, like we've been a failure in that process. But that's thinking and focusing too much, I think, on the obstacles instead of on our God, who is the one we believe has called us here, and recognizing that there's no obstacle too great for him to defeat. And then finally, no one cares or understands this idea of isolation that we get ourselves into, often the aloneness that the devil wants us to feel like we're isolated and separated and distanced from everybody else who would understand at a heart level or care for us in a proximity level. And we can't believe that, because if we do believe that, it's a certain cause of creating situations and circumstances for many of us to want to quit or walk away. Now, I've already mentioned a few in the lies that I believe, we believe, but here's some other contributors to a lack of perseverance in our lives as well. Pragmatism is kind of a cut and paste strategy in doing ministry. And if we're looking for quick shortcuts to how we are to do ministry, it's going to leave us discouraged and frustrated on a regular basis. Ministry is messy, guys. You guys know that. It's messy. There's no easy one silver bullet type of solution to this. Instant gratification is another. We want to microwave our experience in church life. And we look at results and we think if the results aren't coming in, then something's wrong. And that truncates our experience, makes us want to walk away or start over somewhere else. The cult of personality is what I call the experience in America today, that we are so driven by those who have, by the community standards, whoever writes these books and does these podcasts, who they think they're successful. And thus it's a big personality, a charismatic personality that has to drive this experience to help us. And if we feel like we're not that kind of person, or we can't be that kind of person, it may leave us feeling disenfranchised and to the degree that we want to move somewhere else. Comparison is very similar to that. Do we look at the churches around us, or we look at other ministers and we think, I ought to be further down the line from here than I am, or I'm not as good as so and so, and that can cause us to lack perseverance, or the expectations and assumptions that can be within our heart or within our congregation. All of those kind of things can make us, can contribute to us lacking perseverance in the experiences when we encounter the struggles and the difficulties of moving forward. So I want to take us to some Bible passages pretty quickly, but I do want us I want to leave you with some passages tonight that I think will help all of us that are going through these kinds of moments, and we all do from time to time in our ministry experiences. 2 Timothy 2, verses 1 through 10 speak to this issue. As Paul is talking to young Timothy as he's starting his ministry, he's reminding him to be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus. And that becomes kind of the theme statement he makes in everything that follows, including the verse that we often quote all by itself, that the things that you've heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust these to faithful men who would be able to teach others also. And I would posit to us tonight that faithful men, the word he's using there as he goes into the analogies that he's going to follow that up with, suggest a persevering, an enduring, a patient kind of leader. These are the kind of men that we ought to be. He goes on in verse 3 to say, suffer hardship with me as a good soldier of Christ Jesus. No soldier in active service entangles himself in the affairs of everyday life, so that he may please the one who enlisted him as a soldier. So he's talking about the concern of distraction there. Don't get distracted. Make your commanding officer proud. Don't entangle yourself in all the affairs that would distract you from what you are called to do. Then he moves on to this idea of an athlete and a farmer. And he says, anyone who competes as an athlete, he does it to win the prize unless he does not win the prize unless he competes according to the rules. So he reminds us that we have to have boundaries and we have to live within those boundaries. And I think that's part of what makes us successful in persevering is to know what those boundaries need to be in our life so that we don't get caught up in things that we shouldn't be worrying ourselves over and giving our energy to. The hardworking farmer ought to be the first to receive his share of the crops. He's using a picture there in which he tells us what the adjective is, that these are industrious people. These are hard workers. They are laborious in their labor. They're not going to give up. They're going to move forward and move ahead. And then he goes on and says, consider what I say, for the Lord will give you understanding in everything. Remember Jesus Christ, risen from the dead, descendant of David, according to my gospel. And so he points us to the example of Jesus and calls on us to remember him who has died for us and has risen again, and for which I, Paul, suffer hardship, even to imprisonment as a criminal. But the word of God is not imprisoned. For this reason, I, Paul, endure all things for the sake of those who are chosen, so that they also may obtain the salvation which is in Christ Jesus, and with it eternal glory. So there he gives us some analogies and some illustrations and the challenge to stay faithful to what God has called us to. And he has given us the example of Jesus Christ and himself suffering hardship, going through difficulty and adversity, all calling upon us to endure and persevere. Why? For the sake of those who are chosen, so that they too can obtain the salvation which is in Christ Jesus, and with it eternal glory. So here are some things I think are contributors to perseverance. And I think the first one, and probably the most important one, is an understanding of your own calling. How passionately committed to you or to your calling are you? I think that's what has kept me here in the field of ministry, I don't know, countless times over the years that I've been involved. There have been so many days, and usually I call those so many days Mondays when I want to walk away from ministry. The day after Sunday, it can often be a brutal day for us in ministry, right? I'm an interim pastor at a church right now, and we're going through that week after week after week. I know exactly what that experience is like. The people you listen to make a difference when it comes to perseverance. Who is in your ear? What are the voices that you are blocking out, and who are you listening to? Makes a huge difference. The boundaries you put in place so that you live your life and are able to, for example, leave work at the office as much as possible instead of bringing it home into your family life. If you want to talk about that, I'll be glad to talk to you about that, how we deal with that in our work. Where do you find joy and fulfillment? Does the work and the ministry satisfy you? Does it fulfill you? Does it enrich you? And do you find joy and meaning and purpose and significance in it? If so, it will contribute to your desire for perseverance. How you define success? Do you define it in terms of numbers and metrics and such, or is it defined in terms of faithfulness and a commitment to following Christ, whatever he asks you to do? Keeping an eye on the horizon, the eternal perspective, instead of just on what we're dealing with temporally, will keep you from getting caught up in the hurricane of experience right now and realizing this too will pass. And yet the horizon always calls us forward to remind us we're citizens of heaven, right? Your own relationship with the Lord, how close you are to him, will help you in times like this. Your prayer life, your time in the Word, your fellowship with those that you worship with. If you're able to worship on Sunday, if you're not, that's a whole nother issue we need to talk about some other time maybe. But the closeness you are to the Lord, and when you don't feel like persevering, this is what I do. I spend more time in prayer, more time in the Word. It becomes more important that I have the intimacy with God, because being close to his heart and his side is what's going to continue to pull me forward in the work that he's called me to do. And then having a heart that is filled with love and gratitude. I think if you can't express those those feelings, those character traits out of your heart toward others, then again, in my life, I have to pray and get rid of things like bitterness and resentment and an unforgiving spirit. And I literally go through a book every day I have for 2 decades, which is a list of things I'm grateful for. And I just repeat it every day. So many of these things I'm grateful for. Next page, so many of these things I'm grateful for tomorrow. Gratitude makes a huge difference in perseverance. All right. So 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 1, Paul reminds the people there, because we've been given this ministry by the mercy of God, we don't give up. Can I remind you of that tonight? That you were given this ministry, you didn't choose it. God called you, He gave it to you. And He did that not because you earned it, only because it's His mercy at work in your life. You're a broken person, I'm a broken person, but by the mercy of God, He has chosen us to be involved in this ministry. So Paul's conclusion is we don't give up because of that. Even in the face of the currents of the world that we are having to deal with, we still don't give up because God has called us there and He has a purpose for us to be there. So be steadfast, immovable, always excelling in the work of the Lord, knowing your work for Him is not in vain. Did you catch that last line? You must know that your work for Him is not in vain. Never in vain. It's never in vain. It's not, if we're doing what God has called us to do. So let me finish with this statement, and then we'll go to questions. I really do think that ministry is a marathon, not a sprint. So be in it for the long haul. Look far to the future, not just nearby. Recognize that results take time, and much of that work is unseen, but absolutely necessary before it can ever be seen. It has to take place inside hearts, and character has to be developed. You and I need affirmation, and thus we need each other. We need brothers and sisters in the faith that can encourage us, and pastors. We need other pastors that can come alongside us and understand the world that we live in and what we have to deal with. And we need to be a band of brothers. You can't do this in isolation. You shouldn't do this in isolation. And then above all things, keep your eyes on Jesus, not on the circumstances that are around you, and especially not on the obstacles that are before you. And Robby just mentioned this verse, so let me close with that. Therefore, since we have such a great cloud of witnesses, let us run the race set before us with perseverance, is what it says in the Christian Standard Version, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. Let us cast off every hindrance and the sin that so easily entangles us, and let us consider Him who endured the cross with suffering, so that we do not grow weary and lose heart. All right, guys, that's where I'll stop, and let's see what you got, Robby, at this point.
Man, David, that's good. I'm writing furiously, as well as taking pictures of the slides.
Well, listen, I'll send the slides to you. You can share them with everybody on here tonight if you want. I'm glad
Okay,
to
well,
do
I've
that.
worked really hard to try to transcribe what you're
Yeah,
saying.
yeah, no worries on that. No worries on that. Appreciate it.
One of the first things that struck me when you were talking about, and then there's something else I want to ask in a minute before that, but
Mhm.
when you were talking about the life cycle, we have a lot of church planting going on up here, and this will be cataloged and it'll be something I'll communicate to church planters as well as other pastors to
Mhm.
watch. And how would the life cycle differ um, in a church plant? Honeymoon and all those things. It's that was fascinating how that's changed and everything's accelerated, and those categories are almost defined differently now.
Yeah.
But what about for a church plant? Do you have any
Well, I have a gut feeling on that. I don't have any research to show, but I do think that the honeymoon period will extend longer for a church planter because there's no predecessors. There's no
Mhm.
history in the church, and thus typically no people that have preceded the church planter himself in the congregation. that gives him a sense of tenure, a sense of seniority, and he becomes the source of credibility right off the bat for most of the people that come into the church. They know full well they're coming into this church. Now, if he's getting a lot of transfer growth, that'll be shorter than it will if
Mhm.
he's reaching a lot of new believers in his community. But it will extend the honeymoon period, and in likelihood, it will extend all of those things, stretch them into the future a little bit longer, and create a lot less conflict unless he precipitates it himself through his own
Mhm.
life and ministry, or there are some guys that kind of feed off of conflict, so they may actually fuel it through their experiences or their personality in some ways. But for most folks, it will just simply be shorter conflict, longer honeymoon.
Okay. I figured your gut would have something good to say.
My gut's always got something to say.
Something good
I
is
don't
what
know if
I'll
it's
say.
good or not, but it's always got something to say.
And another question from one of the early slides, your definition of perseverance. I thought that was really helpful.
Mhm.
The endurance versus patience versus perseverance. You know, sometimes in passages, it may be translated endurance, it may be translated perseverance, but I think the nuance is really helpful. And I was just wondering if your definition of the quality of continuing to do something despite difficulties or obstacles with no certain end in sight. Would you be willing to share a story or two about where you think your perseverance muscles have been stretched and exercised and developed?
Um, sure. I was in a church there in New England, south of Boston, and we had a guy in our church that, uh, for lack of a better term, he loved rules and regulations. He was just that kind of guy. And early on, he challenged me on something in the bylaws, and I came to learn pretty quickly it wasn't going to be the last time he was going to challenge me on something in the bylaws.
Hmm.
And so having to deal with that over a period of the next 4 or 5 years was going to be something that was going to be it was going to be needful for me to make sure that I had done my homework, that I was prepared with some of the what if questions that he might have that would try to distract not just me, but us from the
Mhm.
mission that God had for us in the work that he had called us to do, be getting caught up in all these little technicalities and things like that. Eventually, I mean, we obviously had to have some face-to-face conversations to deal with some of those issues, and though we never agreed completely on what was happening in the experience of our church and the direction that he was seeking to take us, with some of the questions that he would bring up in a business session, or grab me and pull me aside to say, hey, you can't do this or that kind of thing. Um, we reached a place where we were able to keep the mission moving forward because we were able to, in my own heart, able to come to a place where I could um, deal with him in a loving and caring way, and to recognize that all that he was saying and doing wasn't really personal, but he had been hurt by somebody before who had taken advantage of him and had, um, he didn't trust leadership, is what I'm trying to say.
Mhm.
And so we had to talk about that some, and come to a place where we were able to move forward, and we were able to do that in the last year or two I was there.
It, another thought that passed through my mind, um, the obstacles come from within, come from without,
Mhm.
internal, external, lots of different obstacles. But as
Mhm.
a leader, those obstacles are going to come our way. And I know you had a health situation a few years back,
Right.
and that your very definition of that, um, continuing to do something despite difficulties or obstacles with no certain end in sight. Just, I mean, there's a sense of uncertainty
Yep.
with a health issue like that. But can you speak to that for a moment?
Yeah, it was. It was a heart attack that I had in 2014. It was right before I came back to New England, the last time we lived and ministered there. We were living in Baltimore, Maryland area at the time, and we had been going through some difficulty in terms of, I don't know if any of you guys that are on here tonight have ever had to deal with like you're an associate to a person who has the ability to make decisions that affect you and even your livelihood, whether you can stay and be on staff with them or not. But that was essentially the situation. And I began to deal with a lot of these things in a very unhealthy manner. Um, uh, and as a result of that, the stress grew to the point where I had a heart attack. And so I learned a lot through that experience. I learned to take better care of myself. We talked about that in the breakout that we did at the annual meeting. But I also learned that in the midst of all of the things that were going on, that my calling was sure. And this was really important to me because there have been two or three times in my ministry. I mentioned that one at year 5, and then later on in California when we were out there, and I was also a staff member at a church. And then at this particular instance that we're talking about right now, where it would have been really easy to walk away, or
Mhm.
I probably could have got fired, either one of those situations. But in both instances, I held strong to my calling. My sense of calling is very internal. I can remember and tell you the whole story of my calling. It's not something that somebody else suggested to me, or I didn't go to school just to get a degree in this. I did all of those things because I knew God was calling me to do this. And so that has kept me more than anything else, I think. That and my closeness to God, which has waxed and waned. I'm going to tell you right up front, it's waxed and waned. There have been good times, there have been bad times, but I can tell you it's as good now as it's ever been in my life. I spend more time with God every day, and I want to encourage everybody, don't make the mistake I did to think that your work for God can replace your time with God. Don't do that. Don't do that because you will rationalize like I did that God called me to this, but he knows I don't have anybody else to do this. So I got to do all this work and I don't have time to spend with him because I'm doing this stuff for him. Nope. He wants time with you more than he wants the work for him. He can get somebody else to do that work. He needs you to be close to him. And that will be what helps persevere you, preserve you even through the difficult times when they come, because they will come.
Yeah, I on your contributors to perseverance, I had circled your calling and close to God. And in the breakout at the annual meeting, you shared a little bit about how your closeness to God had grown during that particular season, which was the context of the example that you used.
Mhm.
What kind of in terms of your calling, we see that everywhere. You know, the race that's been marked out for you.
I,
Any suggestions if you're wrestling with that and trying to understand, because a lot of stuff, the obstacles, the weight, you know, in terms of the endurance, can sure threaten that, erode that.
Yeah, again, I think part of it is an internal thing where you have to spend time. I mean, there's just no way that you can avoid spending time with God
Mhm.
to find the assurance that this is the clarity is a better word, the clarity that this is what God wants me to be and do. Now, there are a lot of statements in the Bible already about what He wants us to be as followers of Christ. Okay,
Mhm.
so let's not miss those when we start looking for. He's calling me to pastor. He's calling me to be a missionary. He's calling you to be a follower of Christ first and foremost. Every one of us. Okay. And there's a whole lot about that, which has to do with the closeness with God. It has to do with obedience and has to do with trust. Those kind of, how are you doing in the trust quotient? How are you doing in the obedience quotient? You know, those kind of things are pretty important. But then after you're looking at scripture and in prayer and finding some sense of clarity about that, then I do believe that when it comes to our calling, there will be some outward signs of confirmation that will take place through the community of faith, through other believers that will see the hand of God on us, the call of God on our lives. And those kind of things often lead us to a point where we go through an ordination process and such like that. Or after the fact will be things that reaffirm and re-engage and remind us that God has set us apart for this special work. And if that's the case, guys, this is just me talking, but I just don't know how you can walk away from that.
Hmm.
Um, you
That's
know,
good.
Paul says in the book of Romans, the call of God is irrevocable.
Hmm.
So this is me talking, but I take that literally. Yeah.
What about as a pastor, as a leader, as a lay leader? Um, how do you help create that environment, that atmosphere? We see where Paul says to love and stimulate one another towards good deeds. But how do you, as a leader, pastor, help people get a handle on just this whole perseverance, endurance thing? How can you encourage?
Yeah, I think with lay people, the most important thing I would suggest, at least, would be that they understand their giftedness, their sense of how God has gifted them for ministry. Now, if they're plugged in to use their giftedness, their passions, the kind of ways that God's created them, and they are His workmanship, right? We are His workmanship. So He's created us. He's custom designed each of us in a very special way with those gifts, those passions, those desires. And if we're plugged into ministry in the right place, I think it's pretty easy for us to find a sense of fulfillment and joy and celebration in that. And again, we can do it out of obligation and duty, but it's that's not what God wants. God wants us to do it out of love and joy, right? Out of the joy of being able to do with Him, for Him, what He has created us to do. So I think perseverance is much easier in a situation like that, even when you do encounter some difficulties and some struggles. Because again, I think the longer you mature in life, the older you are, like me. I'm an old guy now. It becomes easy to recognize you can't avoid conflict. You
Mhm.
can't you can't dismiss. You're not going to live a life without challenges. They're everywhere. So it's just a part of life, right? And so as you deal with that, if you're doing what you're created to do, if you're doing it with the joy of the Lord and finding a sense of fulfillment and joy in it, it's much easier to do, right? Much easier to do. Now, here's the thing pastors need to hear about that. If you plug people in the right way, it's great because your people are going to be happy, satisfied, and find significance in that work, that ministry. But if we're not careful, pastors, we will burn them out because we will work them too hard. One of the things, and I said this in my presentation early, and I said if we got back to it, maybe we would talk about it. Let me just mention it real fast. I mentioned this in our breakout, Robby, before. I think we all need to have rhythms in life, and the best way, the easiest way to talk about rhythms in life is to say, take your day and divide it into 3 blocks of time: morning, afternoon, and evening. Give 2 of those blocks to your work, one of those blocks to yourself and family. You know, make sure you don't use all 3 of those blocks all the time. And if the only extra block lay people have is doing this ministry over and over and over and over again, then that's going to rob them of the time that they have with their family and often some of the things that they find joyful in their own life, the avocations of life, hobbies of life, the leisure time of life. They can't continue to survive that way either. So we have to monitor this for all of our people for their own spiritual health's sake, as well as physical concerns and such too.
So the pastor or the leader to go back to the days of standing up at the annual recruitment time of the year and needing some middle school Sunday school teachers or group leaders to talk about Johnny becoming a drug addict or a financier on Wall Street and getting arrested, for manipulating money and situations is probably not the best way to enlist someone to a particular ministry. You spoke of the gifting and passion and skill and season of life, all those kinds of things. So that would be something that a pastor or leaders really uh, that needs to be sort of they initiate it that way rather than the other.
I think so, but that's me talking now. In the churches that we worked in the latter years of my life, about the last 20 years of my life, we've always tried to reverse the process, not work from a position strategy where we had to fill positions, but
Mm-hmm.
instead ask the question, who has God brought to this church? Believing that God literally did bring them to the church, that He was behind their interest in our church, their connection with our church, that He wanted them engaged in their church. And if that's the case, then what gifts do they bring? That should help us to understand better what ministries we should be giving to the community, to the church, et cetera, in ways that would help us, and they would find significance. I think pastors would create less conflict in that way because there wouldn't be as many frustrated people
Mm-hmm.
in churches, and that wouldn't frustrate pastors. Then they would find joy in the fact that they're helping people connect in a place where they're created to connect and they're flourishing, so they're growing as disciples, and on and on and on. That's what it's all about, right?
Yeah. Now, you had the one slide contributions to lack of perseverance are some
Mhm.
categories that contribute to that pragmatism, cult of personality, etc. Do you see anyone that's particularly challenging or particularly pervasive for a certain kind of person or a certain type of ministry? Or I'm not even sure I'm giving you the question, but is it pragmatic, results driven? Yeah, because that can come from and come from within.
Yeah, I think for me it's results driven. I don't know that it is for everybody. Some people are more caught up in comparisons, or thinking I'm just not the strong, charismatic, outgoing
Mm-hmm.
leader, that kind of thing, and thinking they have to be that. Maybe it's just assumptions and expectations. I'm my own worst enemy. I don't know if that's true of all pastors, but or leaders or people. But I'm pretty sure that I have uh, some incorrect expectations and assumptions in terms of my own role, my own ministry, my own life. God's working all those things out of me, as He works His work, His sanctification into me. But He's got to get a lot of that stuff out. I have to unlearn a lot of those things because I look around, or I read too many books, or I watch too many podcasts or uh, streaming preachers, and I think, man, um, I can preach better than him. Why aren't I doing better?
Mm-hmm.
Why isn't God blessing my ministry the way his ministry seems to be blessed? And I get frustrated and can get angry or resentful if I'm not careful about that. Or I can assume things have moved faster for him in some ways, and I don't understand why. And so I draw my own conclusions. I fill in the blanks all the time when I don't know them. And those scripts lead to bad places, and they don't make me want to persevere at all because I'm not staying within the boundaries we talked about before, within the rules and regulations that an athlete understands. If you're going to compete, you compete to win, but to win, I got to stay within the rules, the boundaries. I've got to
Mm-hmm.
do what I'm called to do. And if I'm distracted and looking around and I'm getting in everybody else's way or trying to be like them instead of run the race that I'm called to run, then I got a problem.
Would you have any advice to give to pastors and leaders in terms of the need for relationships in ministry, um, in terms of how that relates to perseverance? You said the people that you listen to, but beyond that, in terms of just having people.
I think it's huge. I think it's huge. So yeah, my advice would be to have a few close friends. And I think obviously as you get older, some of those ought to be generational friends. I really am thankful that I have less than a handful, but I have that handful of friends that go back to my childhood almost.
Hmm.
And they've watched my life, they've spoken into my life, they've encouraged me, they have not abandoned me in any way. I can still call on them, I can still keep in touch with, and I do all the time with those folks, and that means the world to me. And so I would say to folks, yeah, I think there's a time when if you haven't gotten there yet, you will get there where you'll realize your skill set's not going to get you much farther. What's going to get you farther is the character of your life and the relationships that you have. And it's going to be those things that are going to anchor your work with your relationship with God and your work for Him. And so you want to invest in those relationships in ways that cause encouragement and support for them in the field, wherever they're at, whatever they're doing. Most of my friends are not ministers that I'm talking about right now, but some of them are. And at the same time, that will reciprocate. The one who needs friends must show himself friendly, right? It
Hmm.
works back and forth in those kind of relationships over time, and so that's been very significant for me. And I'll underscore it again by saying you're not going to make it in ministry, in my opinion, if you live your life in isolation and you silo yourself and you cut yourself off. There's risk involved in this ministry, but there's risk in all of life. And so you just got to trust God to provide for you the wisdom and discernment you need to be able to pour into the right people, to open up to the right people, to share with the right people, and to encourage and empower the right people. And are you going to make some mistakes? I did, but I'm still standing. I think part of my sanctification process was the mistakes I made and how God used them in redemptive ways in my life, and also with the scars that I'm able to tell the story of those scars today, and do it in a way that testifies to the goodness of God and His provision for me. For where I'm weak, He's strong, right?
I can't remember who first said the phrase. Maybe they got it from the story of Jacob. It might have been John Wimber, actually. Said, never trust a leader that doesn't walk with a limp,
Yeah,
be it
yeah.
a limp, be it a scar.
That's good. That's definitely good. And that harkens obviously back to the story of Jacob wrestling with God. I think everybody has to wrestle with God on their own. You can't inherit anybody else's experience. It's got to become your own, and that is what happens. We all have a thorn in the flesh, to put it another way, and God allows that to happen for a reason, so that we'll depend on Him, and so that He is seen through our lives, not just we're seen.
One other question that comes to mind that for those that will be listening to this tonight or later is you were just talking about isolating ourselves and much of New England is rural ministry, or it could be urban, but with so many neighborhoods and boroughs, you're still kind of on a little island, even in the
Yeah.
largest city. Um, Perseverance in terms of being isolated, not just you as a leader or a pastor, but for you and your family. Um, Anything you can say to that, just out of your gut?
My God always has things to say. Uh, a couple things. I think you just have to be intentional and deliberate with other folks. I know Phil Waldrop does some retreats up there, so some of these ministers and lay people have opportunities to get to know some others that are from other parts of the region. Don't just let that be a standalone retreat event or the annual meeting that we have when we get together there. Um, Build relationships there that you can follow up on in between these times where you can connect and you guys can plan times where you get together. And I know that will be sporadic and not very regular, but it can be very significant if you do plan some deliberate times. And then I just think, we all have to take advantage of these kind of tools that we're using tonight. Uh, we have kids that have been all across the country during part of their young adulthood, and as a result, we've learned how to Zoom and have meetings together as family in a variety of places. That's not perfect. I understand that. It's not the same kind of fellowship, but it is fellowship that reminds us we're not isolated and alone unless we choose to be. So, like your cohort that we're doing with the pastoral leadership group, this is a way that pastors can get involved and engage with other pastors, commiserate a little bit, but find collegiality and support and encouragement and prayer at the same time. So that no matter how isolated their geography may be, their heart doesn't have to be isolated. They don't
Mhm.
have to be separated
Good.
spiritually from brothers and sisters in Christ, who will come alongside them and support them in that ministry. We do that all the time through these kind of experiences there in BC&E and other places. So I would say to everybody out there, join one of these groups, get involved, make sure that you're connected. If you can't do it in person on a regular, ongoing basis, or don't have families that you can share with or go fellowship with regularly, at least find one online that you can connect with and be able to be prayed for, supported, encouraged, and assisted uh, down the road.
That's good. I know the one cohort we're talking about. Um, there's three different generations represented with with multiple people in each generation,
Yeah, that's
and
good.
um, and already that's I, I look forward to that time
Mhm.
because I think guys are in just three meetings. I think it's three or maybe four. Guys have really kind of you can tell there's some barriers, maybe not afraid to say anything or reveal, but just the comfort level is
Mhm.
rising, and
Sure.
the laughter is more natural. The concern is more genuine, more empathy, more listening that's going on. So I thank you for suggesting that as an option. I do think that we need to take some initiative, and because we can't expect people to read our mind.
Right. Exactly. We make assumptions that they ought to know, and then we're the ones that lose out because we allow our assumptions to drive our inactivity or our lack of decision making
Mhm.
to engage or to take the initiative. Let's just do it. If we need it, we should do it. And all of us need it. So take the first step. Take the first step. Talk to your director of mission or regional coordinator. Talk to the
Yeah.
state staff that's close to you. Some of these states also have regional cohorts. I'm in one with the group in Maine right now as well. There are other things that are engaging pastors and lay leaders all across the convention. I'm sure that you can find a place to plug in. You should.
Yeah. Well, David, thank you so much. Any concluding thoughts that you have that you go, I forgot to say that?
No, I'm a victim of always saying too much, honestly, and I think plenty of people are thinking that already. I've always got too many slides and too much information and too many words to say. I will just say to the guys and the gals that are listening tonight, I don't know who you are. I haven't seen a list, and I can't see any of your faces, but I'm here for you on the presentation that I'll send to Robby to be shared with you. There are two other slides that I did not show you. One is a bibliography of books and a podcast and an article that comes out of Baptist Press last week that all deal with perseverance. So if you want to go deeper and you want to get past my thoughts to some thoughts of some real significant people like Mark Halleck and Brian Croft and Jack Daniel there in New England, then read some of these books or read what Chuck Lawless wrote in Baptist Press this past week. Find those things. Listen to Bob Bickford and Jimbo Stewart at our replant team talk about passion and perseverance. That will help you a lot more as you take this further and you really apply it to your life as well. And then the final slide is my contact information. If there's any way that I can be of help to you, don't hesitate to drop me a text or give me a call. We'll set something up. We'll talk together. We'll face to face like this, or whenever I'm up there, maybe we can even get together. I'll take you out for coffee and we can learn from each other. Glad to do that. I'm thankful for the opportunity, Robby, for to be with you tonight.